The idea that calling black people racists is an extension of reverse racism comes from a misunderstanding or oversimplification of the term racism and its implications. Here's how this concept can be unpacked. Misconception of racism as individual prejudice. The term reverse racism is often used to describe perceived discrimination against a dominant or historically privileged group, usually white individuals, by members of marginalized groups. However, this idea typically fails to acknowledge that racism is not just about individual acts of bias, but is deeply connected to systemic and institutional power. The fallacy of reverse racism. When someone accuses black individuals of being racist towards white people, they often overlook the broader power dynamics that have historically oppressed and marginalized black communities. Reverse racism assumes a symmetry in experiences and power between racial groups, which does not align with the historical context or current societal structures in many Western societies. Calling black people racists in this sense disregards the systemic nature of racism and conflates individual prejudice with institutional power. Attempting to equalize marginalized voices with dominant narratives can be problematic. Labeling black people as racist is sometimes seen as an attempt to invalidate legitimate expressions of anger, frustration, or criticism directed at oppressive systems. By framing these expressions as racist, the dominant narrative shifts focus away from the historical and ongoing oppression faced by marginalized communities and seeks to equate it with the experiences of the dominant group. This can diminish the validity of critiques against power structures and the racism entrenched in them. Historical and structural power imbalances play a crucial role in understanding racism. Racism, as understood in the sociological sense, involves a combination of prejudice and power. Without systemic power to enforce biases, accusations of racism against marginalized groups lack the same institutional backing that would categorize them as equivalent to systemic racism. The idea of reverse racism does not account for this power imbalance and instead frames isolated expressions of bias or anger from marginalized groups as equal to institutional racism. Calling black individuals or other marginalized groups racist perpetuates misunderstanding. This extends the concept of reverse racism by ignoring the context and purpose of the original definition of racism. It can undermine discussions on systemic racism by redirecting the narrative toward individual acts of prejudice without addressing the root causes of power and inequality. In summary, calling black people racist is an extension of reverse racism in that it attempts to equate individual prejudice with systemic oppression. It misinterprets the fundamental nature of racism as a structural issue and shifts focus away from the historical and institutional power dynamics that shape racial inequality. By framing anger or criticisms from marginalized groups as racist, it perpetuates a false equivalency that fails to recognize the real differences in experiences and systemic realities.